The temperature in Gallatin, Tennessee had dropped to 19 degrees by the time Cole Hadley turned off Hartsville Pike and into the library parking lot, and the ice on the pavement was the kind that doesn't show until you're already on it. He hadn't planned to stop. He'd been driving back from a job site in Lebanon, and the library lot was simply the first flat ground he saw when his back tire caught the first patch of black ice, and his body made the decision before his mind did. In the passenger seat, River lifted his head, then stood on all four legs, which he never did in a moving vehicle, and pressed his nose against the window toward the far corner of the lot. There, half hidden between a concrete barrier and the shadow of the rear wall, was a sand-colored Buick LeSabre with the engine idling and the windows fogged completely white. And in the front seat, barely visible through the condensation, was a shape that was a person. Very small, very still, leaning against the driver's window in a way that Cole recognized. And the part of him that had learned to read the difference between rest and something worse, as a person who had been in one position for too long, what Cole Hadley learned in the hours and days that followed, about 3 nights in a parking lot in December, about a will contested and a piano claimed, and a life dismantled piece by piece, and about a veteran's mutual aid check that had been waiting 4 months in a drawer in Murfreesboro for a woman no one had been able to find, would not end in that parking lot. This channel tells stories like this one. If you're new here, subscribe before we go any further. You'll want to stay for what comes next. Cole had come to Gallatin from Clarksville 10 months ago, following a job and a decision, and not much else. He was 34. He had served 2 tours, the first in Kunar Province, the second in Paktika, and had come back from the second one carrying a thing he had not yet found a name for, which was the absence of his squad leader, Staff Sergeant Aaron Petty, who had been 41 years old and from Sevierville, and who had never made it onto the plane home. Cole did not talk about Petty. He had photographs. He had a challenge coin he kept in his left jacket pocket and touched without meaning to, when the world required more from him than he thought he had. He drove for a construction contractor in Sumner County and was good at it and showed up reliably and said the right amount. Not too little, not enough for anyone to ask questions. He lived in a rented duplex on a street where people walked dogs in the evening and waved from their yards, and he waved back. And this had been enough for a while. River had come from a military working dog program in Lackland. A yellow lab, 9 years old, retired from explosive detection after blowing a ligament in his left rear leg that had healed well enough for living, but not well enough for service. He was 68 pounds and moved with the particular unhurried authority of old dogs who have done serious work and know they have earned their pace. He did not bark indoors. He had one expression, calm, attentive, present, and he wore it the way certain people wear confidence, not as performance, but as the simple outcome of knowing who you are. When Cole's nights went sideways, River would wait until Cole had been still long enough, and then put his whole chin on Cole's knee and leave it there. And Cole would put his hand on River's head, and both of them would breathe. And somewhere in the breathing, something would release, and the night would become more possible. Cole got out of the truck. River was out before he was, on the ice, moving carefully toward the Buick on his repaired leg. Unhurried, certain. Cole came around to the driver's side and tapped on the fogged window. Once, gently, the way you knock when you don't want to frighten. The figure inside startled, a sharp pulling away movement, and then the window began to come down in increments, the old manual kind, cranked slowly, and a face appeared. She was old. He couldn't have said precisely how old. The cold had made her face a particular kind of pale that removed markers, but she was old, and her eyes, when they focused on him, were the steady, clear gray of someone who has had a long time to learn that the world sometimes delivers a surprise and sometimes doesn't, and who meets each possibility with the same measured attention. She looked at him. She looked at River. River had sat down beside the driver's door. "Good morning," she said, as though she were opening a door on a Sunday. "Ma'am." Cole said, "How long have you been here?" A pause. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Since Friday evening," she said. "It was Monday. Are you hurt?" "No," said simply, without armor or apology. "I'm cold, though. I think I'm quite cold." She said it the way you say something you've been not saying for 3 days, and the saying of it comes out plainly because you've used up the energy required to soften it. Cole opened the door. River moved in immediately, not intrusively, not dramatically, simply went directly to her feet where they rested on the floor mat and put his nose against her right shoe and stayed there. Cole saw the shoe then. The sole had separated at the toe, a split of 2 or 3 inches, and through the gap he could see that she was wearing a single thin sock on that foot, and the sock was damp. She looked down at River. Something happened in her face. A softening but quiet, the way ice softens before it moves. She reached down slowly and put her hand on his back, and River turned his head toward her hand, and she made a small sound that was not quite a word. Her hands, when she reached, showed him everything. The knuckles were swollen and dark red from 3 nights of cold that not even an idling engine fully defeats. And her right hand had a stiffness to it that she did not try to hide because she was past the point of managing appearances. She had been managing appearances for 4 months, and she was out of the resources required. He got her out of the car carefully. She would not be steadied without permission. She asked for his arm rather than accepting it unasked, which told him something about who she was. He walked her to his truck, which was still warm, and settled her in the passenger seat, and turned the heat to as high as it went, and River climbed in behind her and lay down across the back seat without being told. Her name was Irene Voss. She was 88 years old. She had taught piano in Gallatin for 44 years, individual lessons out of the house on Hartsville Road. The house that had been hers and Walt's for 51 years, with the upright Steinway in the front room and the practice bench worn smooth from 4 decades of children sitting up straight at her instruction. She had played organ at First Presbyterian for 47 years, every Sunday, every Christmas Eve, every Easter, every funeral of every person in that congregation who had gone before their time or in their proper time or anywhere between. She knew the inside of that organ the way surgeons know bodies. Every stop, every mechanical quirk, every pipe that spoke a half note flat in the cold. In 2003, the church had restored the pipe organ with a fundraising campaign Irene had organized herself, and when it was complete, they had mounted a small brass plate on the lower cabinet. This organ restored in honor of Irene and Walt Voss. She had not known they were going to do that. She had cried quickly and then composed herself and sat down and played the doxology, because that was the appropriate response. Walt had died in October of the previous year, 62 years of marriage. He had been a farmer and a deacon and a man who repaired his own equipment and trusted his own judgment and had a handshake that people in Sumner County had been accepting as a binding contract since 1965. He had served in Korea, 2 years, the worst of it, the winter that killed more men than the bullets did, and he had come home and put it behind him in the way of men of his generation and gotten on with living, though there were nights, still, when Irene would find him in the kitchen at 3 a.m. staring at the window over the sink, and she would make tea, and he would come back from wherever he'd gone, and neither of them would mention it. He had been part of a Veterans Mutual Aid organization since 1971, a small old-fashioned thing, men who had served together or near each other, paying into a fund that paid out to families when members died. He had mentioned it to Irene once, a long time ago. She had not thought of it since. Walt's will left everything to Irene. That was the straightforward version. The version that happened was different. Their son Marcus was 52 and had been living in the Voss house on Hartsville Road since the previous spring, which had seemed at the time like a kindness. He and his wife Sandra had wanted to be closer, they said. Had wanted to help, they said. Sandra was a woman of organized intelligence who had looked at the Hartsville Road property and performed calculations Irene had not known were being performed. When Walt's will was filed, Sandra had produced a document, a handwritten codicil dated 3 months before Walt's death, during the stretch when his cognition had been softened by medication. That altered the distribution of the estate. The codicil was contested by Irene's attorney. The attorney fees ran through Irene's savings quickly. The house, while the legal question was pending, became functionally Sandra's. Irene's name had never been on the deed. Walt's generation in this county often didn't, an oversight of the era, and Sandra had located this fact and used it with precision. In September, Sandra had told Irene, with great reasonableness, that the house was simply too large for multiple households to manage during the legal process, and that temporary alternative arrangements would probably be for the best. She had said it the way people say things they have already decided. Irene had packed what fit in the Buick. She had driven to her sister's house in Hendersonville and discovered, upon arrival, that her sister's health had declined enough that the house was no longer something Irene could navigate without creating burden. She had driven back. She had spent one night in a motel on the highway until the money she had remaining made that feel untenable. She had parked the Buick behind the library, which was open during the day and blessedly had no one monitoring the back lot at night, and she had been keeping the engine running in 3-hour shifts because she was afraid of the gas. She had not called Marcus. She had thought about it and then not done it. And this decision she had made with full clarity was not confusion or pride, but the recognition that Marcus had made his choice, and she did not have the resources, physical or otherwise, to absorb his apology on top of everything else. She had not called First Presbyterian, where she had played the organ for 47 years, because she did not want to be received as a project. She was a person, not a project, and she intended to remain one. She had told no one. Cole listened. He sat in the parking lot with the heat running and River breathing quietly in the back seat, and he listened to the whole of it without interruption. He had learned in places that do not forgive interruption that listening was a form of action, that the act of receiving what someone had to say, fully and without rushing toward a solution, was sometimes the only thing that made the solution possible. When she finished, the parking lot was quiet. Somewhere behind the library, a crow was talking to something. "My squad leader," Cole said. He didn't know why he said it. He reached into his left jacket pocket and closed his hand around the challenge coin. He was 41. He had 3 kids. He had a wife in Sevierville who, he stopped. He used to say the worst thing wasn't what happened to you. The worst thing was disappearing, becoming invisible to the people around you before anything had actually happened. He paused. He said the mission was to not let that happen to the people near you. Irene looked at him. She looked at his hand in his pocket. She said, "You've been doing that since you got in the truck, whatever's in your pocket." He opened his hand and showed her the coin. She looked at it for a moment. "Walt had one of those," she said. "His organization gave them." "I think it's in his things." She paused. "Sandra has his things." He put the truck in drive. "Has there been a person in your life, a mother, a grandmother, someone you admired, who was too dignified to ask for help, even when asking would have changed everything? Tell me about them in the comments. They deserve to be remembered here." He got her a room at the Holiday Inn on Nashville Pike under his own card without discussing it. He went back to the library lot and drove the Buick to the hotel parking lot, so it was where she could see it. He brought her food from the diner 2 blocks over, and she ate with the focused and grateful attention of someone who has not eaten a full meal in more than a day. And River lay on the floor of the hotel room beside her chair and did not leave that position until she was done. Then Cole started making calls. He called the public defender's office in Sumner County and was redirected twice, and reached, on the 3rd try, a legal aid attorney named James Whitfield who had handled elder financial exploitation cases before, and who listened to Cole's summary in silence and then said, "Is there an active court date?" Cole told him about the Thursday hearing, Sandra's civil claim on the personal property, the piano, the photographs, the 47 years of teaching materials. Whitfield said he could file an emergency motion to stay the property action before Thursday, and that it would likely hold, but he needed Irene present and consenting. Cole said he'd have her there. He called First Presbyterian and got the church secretary, who transferred him to the associate pastor, a man named Gregory Hale, who had been at the church for 11 years and had known Walt and Irene Voss the entire time. When Cole told him where Irene had been sleeping, Pastor Hale was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of quiet that is a person absorbing something they should have already known. He said, "I've been trying to reach her for 2 months. The number I had went to voicemail." Cole said he thought he understood why. Pastor Hale said he would make some calls. Then, Cole called the number written on a postcard he'd found tucked into the sun visor of the Buick while he was moving it. A postcard addressed to Irene, with a Murfreesboro return address, from someone named Dolph Sievers. The postmark was 4 months old. He had found 5 more under the driver's seat mat, each from the same return address, the most recent postmarked 6 weeks ago. Dolph Sievers answered on the first ring. He was 81, and his voice was clear and unhurried. He had served with Walt Voss in the 7th Infantry Division in 1951 and 1952, and he had been the treasurer of the Sumner Valley Veterans Mutual Aid Society for 19 years. Walt Voss had been a contributing member for 53 years. The policy benefit upon death was $114,000, paid in full, designated entirely to Irene Voss. The organization had been trying to deliver the check since November. Every attempt to reach Irene through the Hartsville Road address had been received by a woman named Sandra, who said Irene was unavailable. The postcard attempts, Dolph's own idea, old-fashioned because he'd grown up in a time when a postcard could still find a person, had apparently not been reaching her either. Cole drove to Murfreesboro the next morning. River rode in the passenger seat. Dolph Severs met them at his kitchen table, a small, upright man in a cardigan with Walt Voss's photograph on his refrigerator, and he handed Cole an envelope with the name of the issuing institution on the front and told him to give it to Irene himself. From Walt, which was the right way to think about it. Cole drove back to Gallatin and gave it to her at the hotel room table, with River present. Irene held the envelope. She looked at Walt's name in the return address, the mutual aid organization, but Walt's name in the corner as the policyholder, which Dolph had included specifically for this reason. She held it for a long time before she opened it. When she did, she looked at the amount once and then folded it and set it on the table. She put both hands flat on either side of it. Then she said, "He always said he had things arranged. I never asked him to explain." Wednesday morning, Cole drove her to James Whitfield's office on Main Street. The emergency stay was filed by noon. The Thursday hearing was postponed. The contested codicil, Whitfield advised, was on uncertain legal ground once Irene had funds to mount a proper response, and Sandra's attorneys would know this. Thursday morning, the morning the hearing would have been, First Presbyterian opened its fellowship hall. Pastor Hale had made calls, as promised, and the calls had spread the way calls spread in a valley where people have known each other their entire lives. Helen Marsh was there, 74 years old, a piano student of Irene's from 1967 to 1974, who had been looking for her teacher for 2 weeks after hearing through a mutual friend that something was wrong. Carla Odom was there, a Sumner County deputy, off-duty, who had been the one to find Cole in the library parking lot Monday morning when she'd arrived at the library for her own errand and seen a Marine talking to a woman in a Buick at 7 in the morning and had stood at a distance to make sure it was right before leaving. Dolph Severs drove up from Murfreesboro and sat in the corner and didn't say much and ate 2 pieces of coffee cake. People brought things. The table that was set up along the side wall filled with food, and then with more food because this valley did not know how to respond to need without bringing something, and this had been true for as long as anyone could remember. Marcus Voss arrived at 10:30. He came through the fellowship hall door and stopped. The room was full of people who had known his parents for decades, and they were all present, and Irene was at the center table with Helen Marsh's hand over hers, and Cole was standing to the side with River, and Deputy Carla Odom was in her civilian clothes by the window with a coffee cup and a particular quality of stillness. River saw Marcus come in. He did not growl. He did not move aggressively. He simply rose from where he had been lying at Irene's feet and placed himself in the space between Marcus and the table, and he stood there with his yellow head and his calm eyes and his repaired leg, and he looked at Marcus the way he had looked at 1,000 things in his working life, fully, without blinking, with the complete and unbothered attention of an animal that has already made its assessment and is content to wait. Marcus looked at the room. He looked at his mother. He looked at the dog. Cole walked over. He didn't hurry. He stood beside Marcus and spoke quietly enough that only the two of them could hear it, which was a deliberateness, the choice to not humiliate a man in front of the people who had known his father. The mutual aid policy your father held for 53 years has paid out to your mother, Cole said. James Whitfield has the documentation. The property claim on Thursday has been stayed. The codicil is being contested by an attorney who specializes in cognitive capacity cases and has seen the medical records from that period. He paused. Your mother slept in her car in December for 3 nights. She kept the engine running in 3-hour shifts because she was afraid of using too much gas. He let that land. Marcus looked at his mother. Irene was not looking at him. She was looking at the photograph that Helen Marsh had brought, a photograph from Irene's teaching studio, 1978. 24 children crowded around the upright Steinway, Irene at the bench, everyone's face alive with the particular unself-conscious joy of children who have just played something and know it was good. Helen Marsh was in the front row, She was 7 years old. She was grinning so wide her eyes had almost closed. Marcus Voss was quiet for a long time. He left the fellowship hall before 11. What happened after, between Marcus and Sandra and the attorneys, was slower and less dramatic than the morning, and ultimately more thorough. Sandra's claim on the personal property was not simply stayed, it was withdrawn 3 weeks later, under conditions that Whitfield had negotiated with a patience and precision that Cole recognized as the particular skill of someone who has done this before, and knows that the cleaner the resolution, the longer it holds. The Steinway remained in the house on Hartsville Road, the service photographs remained, the teaching awards remained. Irene returned to the house in January, with a care arrangement funded by the mutual aid policy and overseen by a county social worker who came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and with Marcus's signature on an agreement that Whitfield had prepared and that contained no ambiguity about what the house was and whose it had always been. She was back at the organ at First Presbyterian on the second Sunday of February. Pastor Hale had not announced it. He had simply made sure the organ was tuned and the bench was where it belonged. And when Irene sat down before the service and put her hands on the keys, the congregation, which had been filling in and talking among themselves, went quiet without being asked. She played the prelude. Her hands, which had been swollen and dark red in December, moved across the keys with the steadiness of 47 years. River was in the second pew next to Cole. He lay down with his chin on his paws and his eyes forward, and he did not move for the length of the service. On the lower cabinet of the pipe organ, the brass plate was exactly where it had always been. This organ restored in honor of Irene and Walt Voss, 2003. She touched it on her way out, as she did every Sunday. 2 fingers. The way you touch something you are grateful is still there. What Cole Hadley did on that December morning was not a decision. His back tire caught the ice and his body chose the lot, and River stood up in the passenger seat. And none of it was planned. He did not stop because he intended to change anything. He stopped because the ground was icy and the lot was flat, and because River stood up, and because he had learned in places where it cost everything to learn it, that when River stood up, you paid attention. He had simply paid attention. And what was there, when he looked, was a woman who had been invisible for 4 months. Not because no one cared, but because no one had yet stopped in the right place at the right moment and looked in the right direction. There are moments that feel less like accident and more like appointment. This story is for every person who is living through something enormous in a parking lot somewhere. Not a library lot necessarily, not a Buick, but the equivalent, the thing you haven't told anyone. The situation that is worse than you've let on. And it is for every person who might drive past and might not. Is there someone in your life who has carried something alone, for too long, in too much cold? Leave their name in the comments. Let this section fill with people who deserve to be said out loud. I read every one. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to drive past. If that means something to you, subscribe. There are more stories, and you'll want to be here for them. Which moment in this story stayed with you? I'll see you in the comments.